The rain pounded against the windshield, each drop adding to the drumbeat of dread that thudded in Jackson's chest. He had driven this route 100 times before, weaving through the dense forest that stretched on for miles, but tonight felt different. The storm had come out of nowhere, and the twisting road was swallowed by an unnatural darkness that even his high beams couldn't pierce. The clock on the dashboard glowed 12:04 a.m., the witching hour. His only companion was the GPS voice, droning instructions in the cold, mechanical tone that suddenly sounded far too human. "Turn left," it said, and Jackson hesitated. The GPS had never directed him onto this road before. He squinted through the rain-slicked windshield, barely able to make out the narrow, winding path that disappeared into the shadows. The forest closed in on both sides, ancient trees looming like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out as though to grab him. He shivered and glanced at his phone. No signal. Great, he thought. He'd just take the detour and get back on the main road as soon as he could. The tires crunched over gravel as he turned, and the headlights cast eerie, flickering shadows on the tree trunks. He drove on in silence, the usual sounds of the engine swallowed by the thick, oppressive quiet. As he continued down the winding road, Jackson noticed something odd. Every so often, there would be a flash of movement at the edge of his vision, a pale, thin figure slipping between the trees. He dismissed it as a trick of the light or his imagination running wild, but each time he saw it, his pulse quickened. It felt as though he were being watched. He gripped the wheel tighter, his knuckles white. The GPS had fallen silent, and when he glanced down, the map had frozen. The arrow that represented his car was stuck, unmoving, in the middle of the road. But he hadn't stopped. The odometer kept ticking up, the hum of the engine filling the stillness. Jackson was suddenly aware of every sound, every creak and groan of the car. The rain had slowed, reduced to a light drizzle, but the darkness seemed thicker than before, as if something unseen lingered just beyond the reach of his headlights. Then, out of nowhere, the figure appeared. A woman, dressed in a tattered white gown, stood directly in the middle of the road, staring at him with eyes that glowed in the beam of his headlights. Jackson's foot slammed on the brakes, the car skidding on the wet gravel, and he stopped mere inches from her. She didn't flinch. She just stood there, pale and motionless, her dark hair hanging over her face in wet, tangled strands. He stared at her, frozen, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear anything else. And then she smiled. It wasn't a smile of relief or gratitude. It was a twisted, unnerving grin, stretching far too wide, exposing rows of teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. Jackson's breath hitched, and he felt an overwhelming urge to get out of the car, to walk toward her. His hand reached for the door handle of its own accord. The car's interior light flicked on, casting a sickly glow, and he realized in that fleeting moment that her eyes weren't just glowing, they were watching him. They were waiting. "No," he whispered, snapping out of his daze. He yanked his hand back, shifted the car into reverse, and slammed on the gas. The tires screeched as he sped backward, but when he looked in the rearview mirror, he saw her again, standing there in the middle of the road, staring. She hadn't moved an inch, yet somehow she was closer, her face tilted just enough to make out the glistening, unnatural gleam in her eyes. Jackson's heart raced as he spun the wheel, turning the car around. He didn't care about the narrow road, the branches scraping against the sides as he sped forward. He just needed to get away, to put as much distance between himself and that thing as possible. But no matter how fast he drove, the sense of dread only grew, an invisible weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. He glanced at the GPS, hoping for some reassurance, but the screen had gone dark. The dashboard clock was frozen at 12:04. Suddenly, the car stuttered. The engine whined, and Jackson's stomach dropped as the headlights flickered. No, come on!" he shouted, slamming his hands against the steering wheel. But the lights dimmed, and with a final pitiful sputter, the car died, leaving him stranded in absolute darkness. He fumbled for his phone, praying for a signal, but the screen was blank. In the faint glow of his phone's dimming screen, he saw something moving outside the driver's side window. His breath hitched as he forced himself to look. She was there, her face pressed against the glass, her hands leaving dark, wet streaks as they slid down. Her eyes met his, wide and unblinking, and he could see her mouth moving, forming words he couldn't hear. She lifted one hand, her finger tapping against the glass in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if she were counting down, waiting for him to make a mistake, to unlock the door, to let her in. Jackson squeezed his eyes shut, gripping the steering wheel as if it were a lifeline. He whispered a prayer, his voice shaking, his entire body trembling. When he opened his eyes, she was gone. He dared to breathe, relief flooding over him. But then he felt it, the cold, creeping sensation of fingers trailing down the back of his neck, soft and feather-light, as if someone were right behind him, close enough to touch. He screamed, jerking around in his seat, but the back seat was empty. His mind raced, desperate to rationalize what was happening. He'd heard stories, legends about spirits that haunted the woods, about travelers who had gone missing along this very road, but he'd never believed them. Until now. Without thinking, he tried the ignition again, and to his shock, the engine roared to life. He didn't wait to question it. He threw the car into drive and sped down the road, not caring where he was headed as long as it was away from her. The trees blurred by, and he focused on the faint glimmer of moonlight that broke through the clouds, guiding him forward. Finally, the forest began to thin, the twisted branches giving way to open fields, and he saw the lights of a small gas station in the distance. He pulled into the lot, his hands shaking so badly he could barely cut the engine. He stumbled out of the car, breathing in the cool night air, the scent of gasoline and rain grounding him. An elderly man behind the counter looked up as Jackson staggered inside, his eyes widening in concern. "You all right, son?" he asked, eyeing him with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Jackson nodded, unable to speak, his throat dry and his mind still reeling. He glanced back at his car, expecting to see her standing there, watching him. But the road was empty. He took a deep breath, his pulse beginning to slow. "Rough night?" the man asked, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "You have no idea," Jackson muttered. The man's smile faded, replaced by a strange, knowing look. "You saw her, didn't you?" Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He didn't need to ask who her was. The man sighed, glancing out the window at the darkened road. "She only shows herself to the unlucky ones," he murmured, his voice low. "And once she's marked you," he trailed off, his gaze meeting Jackson's. "Well, let's just say you might want to avoid night drives from now on." Jackson left the gas station without another word, the man's warning echoing in his ears. As he drove away, he kept his eyes on the road, refusing to glance in the rearview mirror. But even as he left the forest behind, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was still out there, waiting, watching, ready to follow him the next time he dared to drive alone at night. The sun had dipped below the horizon hours ago, and with it any sense of security drifted away. Marissa gripped the steering wheel of her rental car, her knuckles whitening as she drove along the desolate stretch of highway. The GPS had failed miles back, and all she could rely on now was the road and the dim glow of her headlights. She tried not to think about how empty it was out here, how there hadn't been another car, house, or sign of life since she'd left the last town behind. The engine's low hum and the whoosh of tires against asphalt were the only sounds breaking the silence. But then, as the night grew deeper and colder, a faint noise began to seep in, a soft, rhythmic tapping. She glanced around, but there was nothing, just the dark stretch of road and the occasional twisted tree flanking her path. The tapping continued, growing louder, and Marissa's stomach twisted with unease. The noise seemed to be coming from somewhere in the car. Suddenly there was a shift in the air, a sensation that she wasn't alone. Her breath caught as she stole a glance into the rearview mirror, half hoping, half dreading to see someone in the back seat. There was nothing, only darkness, and the slight silhouette of the seat's edge. But that tapping, it was persistent, relentless, like fingernails drumming against the surface. Marissa tried to shake off the feeling, chalking it up to the paranoia that long drives often stirred up. But as she continued on, the tapping grew more insistent, each tap seeming to come from a different direction. Her pulse quickened, a chill creeping up her spine. She turned up the radio, hoping the music would drown it out, but the radio was filled with static, a harsh crackling that made her wince. And then, just as she was about to give up and pull over, a voice broke through the static. It was faint, almost a whisper, but unmistakable. "Marissa." Her heart slammed against her chest, and she slammed her foot on the brake, skidding to a halt in the middle of the empty highway. The silence was suffocating, pressing in from all sides, and for a moment she couldn't bring herself to move. She glanced at the radio, which was now eerily silent, the dials frozen. Her mind raced, trying to rationalize what she'd just heard. There was no way, no possible way, anyone could know her name out here, let alone speak it through a dead radio. A sound broke the silence, the crunch of gravel. Her gaze snapped to the rearview mirror again, and this time she saw it, a figure standing just behind her car, illuminated by the red glow of her taillights. The figure was tall, almost unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed elongated, stretched out in angles that didn't make sense. Its face was shrouded in shadow, but she could see its eyes, glinting with a sinister light that made her skin crawl. Marissa's hands shook as she fumbled to shift the car into drive, her foot pressing down on the gas pedal. She glanced back, praying the figure would be gone, but it wasn't. It was closer, just inches from the trunk. Its twisted form shifting unnervingly as it seemed to stare directly at her. She tore down the highway, heart pounding, adrenaline coursing through her veins. But no matter how fast she went, the figure remained in her rearview mirror, its long arms outstretched, almost as if it were reaching for her. She couldn't look away, couldn't break the gaze of those horrible, piercing eyes that seemed to see right through her. And then, without warning, the car began to slow. Her foot pressed harder on the gas, but the engine spluttered, dying with a shudder that left her stranded in the middle of the dark road. Panic surged as she tried to restart the engine, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold the key. As she twisted the key, praying for the car to start, she felt it, a slow, deliberate touch against her shoulder, fingers brushing her neck with a bone-chilling cold that seeped into her skin. Her scream caught in her throat, too terrified to turn around, too terrified to look, knowing that if she did, she'd see that figure sitting in the back seat, grinning with those empty, hungry eyes. But the hand on her shoulder tightened, the fingers curling, pulling her toward it, an invisible force pressing down, suffocating her, consuming her. She couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, could only feel the cold, the dread, the realization that she'd never make it off this road. In her last moments, as the darkness closed in, she finally looked into the mirror one last time and saw not one, but many figures, dozens of twisted faces staring back, watching her as she faded, their mouths opening in silent, endless screams that would echo forever in the night. The night was black as ink, and Nathan could hardly see the road in front of him. The only light came from his dim headlights, struggled to illuminate the narrow, winding road that cut through the mountains. He hadn't planned on taking this route. It was a detour forced on him after his GPS had unexpectedly led him off the main highway, guiding him onto this unfamiliar stretch of road. As he drove on, Nathan's unease grew. He hadn't seen a single car for miles. The trees crowded close, their branches twisted, reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. The silence was thick, broken only by the occasional rumble of thunder as a storm began to gather overhead. His phone had lost signal long ago, and now his car radio had fizzled into static, leaving him alone in the unsettling quiet of the night. A flash of lightning lit up the sky, and for a split second, Nathan thought he saw something at the side of the road, a figure standing perfectly still. The light vanished as quickly as it had come, leaving only darkness. He blinked, wondering if his mind was playing tricks on him. But then another flash came, and there it was again. A figure, pale and unmoving, standing just at the edge of the trees, facing the road. The face was obscured, but he could see the outline of its head, its thin arms hanging limply at its sides. Nathan felt a chill spread through his body, his hands gripping the steering wheel tighter. "Just keep driving," he muttered to himself, pressing down on the gas and willing himself to focus on the road. But the image of the figure lingered in his mind, an uncomfortable presence that refused to fade. As he drove, he couldn't shake the sensation that someone or something was watching him. He glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure standing in the road behind him. The mirror showed only empty darkness, but that only heightened his unease. The car's interior felt suffocating, the air thick and still, as if the night itself had crept into the car, settling over him. And then, without warning, he felt it. A faint whisper, so close it could have been right beside him. "Turn back." Nathan's heart stopped. He froze, every nerve in his body screaming, his eyes darting around the empty car. His skin prickled with cold as he realized the voice hadn't come from outside. It had come from inside the car, as if someone were sitting right next to him. He forced himself to breathe, trying to calm his pounding heart. "It's just the wind," he whispered, though he knew how absurd that sounded. His hands were shaking now, his mind racing, every instinct urging him to stop the car, to get out, to run. But he didn't dare stop, didn't dare slow down. The whisper came again, louder this time, a hiss that seemed to fill the car. "Turn back before it's too late." Nathan swallowed, glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to see a figure sitting there watching him. But the seat was empty. He took a shaky breath and tried to shake off the fear. It was just his imagination, he told himself, just the isolation and the dark playing tricks on him. But as he sped down the road, the whispering continued, growing louder, filling his ears with an insistent, urgent chant. "Turn back, turn back, turn back." He pressed harder on the gas, the car speeding up, the road blurring past in a dizzying rush. He just needed to get out of this place, get back to civilization, and everything would be fine. But then the road ahead shifted, the asphalt buckling as if something were moving beneath it. Nathan slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt as he stared, wide-eyed, at the sight in front of him. The road had twisted into a strange, impossible shape, curling up like a coiled serpent, blocking his path. The trees seemed to close in, their branches reaching out, surrounding his car, trapping him. Panicked, he looked over his shoulder, planning to reverse, but his blood ran cold as he saw the figure from before, standing in the middle of the road behind him. This time, it was closer, close enough that he could see its face, or what should have been its face. Instead, there was only darkness, a hollow void where eyes, a nose, and a mouth should have been. Its head tilted to one side as if studying him, and then it took a slow, deliberate step toward the car. Nathan's hands trembled as he tried to put the car in reverse, his mind reeling, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely think. But the gear shift wouldn't budge. It was stuck, jammed in place, and no amount of force could move it. He looked back at the figure, which was now mere feet away, its blank face twisted in an expression that might have been a smile if it had any features. Desperate, he yanked at the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. He was trapped. His breaths came in shallow gasps, his vision blurring as he realized there was nowhere to go, nowhere to escape. The figure raised one hand, pressing it against the window, and the glass instantly frosted over, thin cracks spiderwebbing from where its fingers touched. The whisper returned, filling the car, a chorus of voices now, all chanting in unison. "Turn back. Too late. Too late." Nathan's scream caught in his throat as the figure leaned closer, its blank face pressed against the glass. He could feel its icy presence, a cold so intense it burned, seeping into the car, into his skin. The last thing he saw before his vision faded was that hollow face, grinning at him, its empty eyes promising an eternity of darkness. When they found his car days later, it was abandoned on that same deserted road, engine cold, doors locked. Nathan was nowhere to be found. Locals whispered that the road had claimed him, that he'd become one of the lost souls doomed to wander its endless twists and turns, forever pursued by the darkness that lurked within the mountain. And on certain nights, if you drove that road alone, you might catch a glimpse of him in your rearview mirror, a figure, standing still, watching, waiting. The road stretched endlessly ahead, empty and desolate under the pale glow of the moon. Lila was exhausted, the kind of bone-deep tired that made her eyelids feel like lead. She shouldn't have taken this route, she knew that. Her friends had warned her about this road, called it Wraith's Hollow, but she'd laughed it off as just another spooky story. An hour into the drive, she began to understand. There were no streetlights, no signs, not even the comforting glow of another car's taillights in the distance. Her headlights illuminated only a short stretch of cracked asphalt and the trees that crowded the road. She could swear the trees were creeping closer, their branches forming a shadowy tunnel. The silence was overwhelming, thick, pressing against her as if the entire forest were holding its breath. As she rounded a sharp bend, she saw something lying across the road, illuminated by her headlights. She hit the brakes and squinted, her heart hammering as she tried to make sense of the shape. It looked like a figure, small, curled up, and perfectly still. She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel. It was a child, Lila bit her lip, her instincts screaming at her to drive on, to not stop. But it was a child alone in the middle of the road. She pulled over, leaving the engine running as she stepped out of the car, glancing around nervously. The silence was oppressive, her footsteps echoing in the void as she approached the child. She called softly, her voice barely a whisper. "Are you all right?" The child didn't respond. It was a little girl, maybe 8 or 9, her dress filthy, her skin pale under the moonlight. Lila reached out, hesitant, and placed a hand on the child's shoulder. The girl's head lifted slowly, her hair falling away from her face. Lila gasped, stumbling backward. The child's face was blank, completely featureless, smooth and pale, like an unfinished doll. The girl tilted her head as though studying Lila, and then her hand shot out, icy cold fingers wrapping around Lila's wrist with a strength that was inhuman. A whisper filled the air, seeping from nowhere and everywhere, a voice as hollow as the girl's face. "Help me." The words wrapped around Lila's mind, suffocating her with a desperate, mournful feeling. She tried to pull her arm back, but the child's grip tightened, her smooth, blank face somehow twisting with anger. Her body was cold as stone, and the longer Lila looked at her, the more her vision blurred, as though she were staring into an endless, suffocating void. With a burst of panic-fueled strength, Lila yanked her arm free, stumbling back to her car. She slammed the door shut, her hands shaking as she fumbled with the gear shift. She floored the gas, speeding past the figure that stood motionless in her rearview mirror, watching her fade into the distance. Her heart pounded as she drove on, glancing in the mirror every few seconds. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was still watching her. The clock on the dashboard was frozen at 3:15 a.m., the time she'd encountered the girl. No matter how far she drove, it wouldn't change. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. Her stomach twisted as she glanced at the passenger seat. There, sitting silently, was the little girl, her head tilted toward Lila, her blank face somehow radiating an unearthly hatred. Her fingers twitched, reaching toward her, and the voice filled Lila's head once more. "Help me," Lila screamed, her car veering dangerously as she tried to keep her eyes on the road. She slammed her foot on the brake, bringing the car to a screeching halt. She turned to the passenger seat, but the girl was gone. Only an empty seat remained, and a strange coldness that lingered in the air, chilling her to the bone. Breathing heavily, she gripped the steering wheel, glancing back down at the clock. It still read 3:15 a.m. The road was silent again, empty, stretching endlessly into the dark. But as she prepared to drive on, she noticed something written on her rearview mirror. Fogged up by her breath, there were words that hadn't been there before. "You'll help me, eventually." With a shiver, she wiped at the mirror, but the message stayed, faint but clear, etched into the glass. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the girl standing there in the dark, watching her. But the road was empty. Swallowing her fear, Lila started the car and drove, her eyes darting to the mirror every few seconds, expecting to see the child in the back seat, her blank face staring back. Hours later, she finally made it to town, collapsing with exhaustion and fear. But the nightmare wasn't over. Every night since that drive, at precisely 3:15 a.m., she would wake up to find those same words written on her bedroom mirror. "You'll help me, eventually." And each night she felt the cold presence growing closer, inching nearer, waiting for the moment when she would finally have no choice but to help the girl who haunted her every breath. The night was pitch black, and Sam could barely make out the road in front of him. His car's headlights seemed swallowed up by the darkness as he navigated the empty country road. He'd been driving for hours, hoping to make it to the next town, before his exhaustion caught up with him. But the road stretched on endlessly, twisting through dense woods that loomed on either side, silent and still. As he drove, he noticed something odd. Every mile or so, he would pass a strange sign, a wooden post with a hand-painted number. The first one he noticed read 10. A few minutes later, he passed another that read 9. He thought it was odd, but brushed it off, assuming they were some sort of mile markers. But then he passed another, and then another. Each one was numbered, counting down, 8, 7, 6. The signs felt like they were counting down to something, and a sense of unease settled over him. When he saw the sign marked 5, a cold chill ran down his spine. Probably just some local thing, he muttered, trying to reassure himself. But as he passed 4, he began to feel watched. The road was completely deserted, yet the feeling of unseen eyes on him grew stronger. He locked his doors, his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. The trees seemed closer now, their branches like twisted fingers reaching toward his car. Then up ahead, he saw the next sign, marked 3. Just past it, a figure stood on the side of the road. It was a man, pale and gaunt, dressed in old tattered clothes. He didn't move, didn't wave, just stared as Sam's car passed by. The man's eyes followed him, unblinking and intense, a hollow look that sent a wave of dread through Sam. He kept his eyes on the road, resisting the urge to look back. Another sign came into view. 2. A few yards beyond it stood another figure. This one a woman with long, dark hair and an expression that looked frozen in horror. Her mouth hung open as if caught mid-scream, but no sound came from her lips. Her eyes were wide, terrified, fixed on him with a stare that bore into his mind. Sam's hands began to sweat, his heart racing as he accelerated. But even as he sped up, the countdown continued. Up ahead, he saw the sign marked 1, and beyond it, 2 figures stood on the road, blocking his path. He slowed down, his mind reeling. The figures, a man and a woman, were dressed in old-fashioned clothing, their faces pale and lifeless. The woman's dress was stained, as though she'd crawled through mud, and the man's jacket was torn and weathered. They stood shoulder to shoulder, staring straight at him with vacant, glassy eyes. Sam felt trapped. He couldn't drive around them. The road was too narrow, with steep ditches on either side. He honked his horn, hoping they would move. But the figures remained still, their blank expressions unchanging. "Get out of the way," he shouted, but his voice wavered with fear. The figures slowly raised their arms, pointing down the road, directing him forward. He stared at them, heart pounding, unsure of what to do. The only other option was to turn around, but as he glanced in his rearview mirror, his heart nearly stopped. Figures lined the road behind him, spaced at regular intervals, each one staring in his direction with that same hollow gaze. Taking a deep breath, Sam pressed the gas pedal, driving between the 2 figures. As he passed, they turned their heads, watching him go with a look of sorrow, as though they knew something he didn't. The road stretched on, and the darkness felt thicker, more suffocating. Ahead, he saw one last sign, smaller than the rest. This one was unpainted, the wood dark and splintered, but he could just make out a single word scrawled on it. 0. The road dipped sharply, and Sam felt his stomach as he descended into a thick fog that seemed to roll out of nowhere, swallowing up the trees and the road. His headlights barely cut through the haze, and every shadow seemed to take on strange, shifting forms. He felt a crushing weight pressing down on him, an overwhelming sense of dread that left him gasping for air. Then, through the fog, he saw something ahead, a dilapidated, old wooden bridge. It looked as though it hadn't been used in decades, its planks weathered and broken. But as he approached, he could see figures standing on the bridge. Dozens of them, all silent and still. They lined the edges, staring at him with those empty eyes, faces twisted in expressions of fear, sorrow, and anger. Sam slowed, heart pounding as he approached the bridge. He knew he couldn't turn back. The figures had closed in behind him, forming an impenetrable line along the road. The only way was forward. He inched the car onto the bridge, the wood creaking ominously beneath him. Halfway across, he glanced out the window and his blood ran cold. The figures were moving now, slowly turning to face him as he drove past. Their eyes followed him, each one filled with a desperate, accusing stare. Then, just as he neared the end of the bridge, the engine sputtered and died. His headlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the figures that now surrounded his car. Panic surged through him as he tried to restart the engine, but it wouldn't turn over. He looked up, his breath catching in his throat. The figures were closing in, their faces twisted with rage, mouths opening in silent screams. Their eyes seemed to burn into him, a sea of hollow, accusing stares. He felt their cold presence press against the car, and his vision began to blur. As the fog thickened, he could hear them whispering, voices filling the air with an endless, sorrowful chant. "Join us! Join us! Join us!" The last thing he saw before the darkness swallowed him was the bridge, empty and silent, stretching back into the fog as if he had never been there at all. And somewhere in the distance, the countdown signs reset, waiting for the next traveler to come down Wraith's Hollow Road. The night was silent as a tomb, and Carla was the only car on the highway, her headlights carving a path through the darkness. She was almost home after a long drive back from visiting her family. The road stretched endlessly, bordered by dark fields and dense forests. The glow from her dashboard clock read 2:03 a.m., and exhaustion was beginning to seep into her bones. Then she saw it. A figure in the distance, standing at the side of the road, illuminated in the beam of her headlights. It looked like a woman, her hair wild, dressed in a long, tattered white dress. She was motionless, her face obscured, her body still as stone. Carla's stomach twisted with unease, but she kept her gaze ahead, gripping the wheel a little tighter as she passed the woman. Just a lonely traveler, she told herself. But when she glanced in her rearview mirror, the woman was still there, standing exactly where she had been. A few minutes later, Carla caught movement in the corner of her eye. Another figure, no, the same woman, was standing by the side of the road again, identical in every way. The same dress, the same wild hair. Carla's heart hammered in her chest as she passed by once more, her speed increasing. The road stretched on, winding through empty fields and eerie clusters of trees, but every mile or so, there she was again. The woman, standing, watching, waiting. Carla couldn't escape the creeping sense that the woman was growing closer each time, inching toward her car as she drove past. The clock on her dashboard blinked to 2:15 a.m. as she spotted the woman yet again, standing directly ahead in the middle of the road, blocking her path. Carla slammed on the brakes, her tires screeching to a halt. Her headlights bathed the woman in a harsh white glow, illuminating her pale, expressionless face. The woman's eyes were dark, empty voids, her mouth twisted into a haunting grin. Carla's pulse raced as the woman began to walk toward her car, each step deliberate, unhurried. Carla fumbled with the gear shift, slamming it into reverse, her hands shaking as she tried to put distance between herself and the figure. But the woman moved faster, her twisted grin widening as she approached. Desperate, Carla turned the wheel sharply, managing to maneuver around the woman and back onto the road. She floored the gas, her car speeding down the highway, the tires humming against the asphalt as she raced away. Her eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, praying that the woman would be gone. But there, in the back seat, she caught a glimpse of movement. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw the woman's reflection, sitting quietly in the seat directly behind her, eyes dark and empty, staring right at her. "Don't look away," a voice whispered, low and hollow, filling the car. Carla's heart pounded as she gripped the wheel, feeling her skin prickle with fear. Every instinct told her to look away, to ignore the figure in the mirror, but she couldn't. She was frozen, trapped under the woman's gaze, her grip on the steering wheel tightening as the figure leaned closer, her breath icy against the back of Carla's neck. "Don't look away," the voice repeated, more insistent, each word like a creeping shadow slipping into Carla's mind. In a moment of desperation, Carla squeezed her eyes shut, swerving off the road. She heard a loud crunch as the car hit something, jolting her violently forward. When she opened her eyes, the woman was gone, vanished from the back seat, leaving only a cold emptiness behind. Carla took a shaky breath, her heart still racing. She opened her door and stumbled out, the cool night air hitting her like a splash of water. Her headlights shone onto the road, but there was no sign of the woman, no trace of anyone else. Thinking she was finally free, Carla turned to inspect the damage to her car. But as she looked into the darkness, she froze. In the distance, she could see a figure standing at the edge of the forest, just barely illuminated by the faint glow of her headlights. It was the woman, her dark eyes shining in the night, her grin wide and triumphant. This time, Carla didn't have the strength to run. She could only watch, paralyzed, as the woman raised a hand and beckoned her forward, her expression a silent command. And as the first light of dawn broke on the horizon, Carla's car sat empty by the side of the road, the door ajar, the engine cooling in the early morning mist. There was no trace of Carla, no sign of where she had gone, only the echo of a single whispered phrase that seemed to linger in the air. "Don't look away." It was nearing midnight when Nate took the shortcut home through Old Mill Road. The town had its legends about the road, a history of strange sightings, disappearing travelers, whispers of ghostly hitchhikers. But it was late, and Nate was tired. The long, empty stretch would save him nearly 15 minutes, and he was willing to risk it. The road was shrouded in fog, thick and damp, swirling around his car as he drove deeper into the winding, narrow lanes. His high beams barely cut through the mist, casting eerie shadows on the dense trees that bordered the road. Nate felt a chill creep up his spine as he noticed something odd in his rearview mirror. A faint light, bobbing and weaving, far behind him. It looked like headlights, maybe from a motorcycle, but the movement was strange, erratic, as if the vehicle were following him at a deliberate distance. He dismissed it, focusing on the road ahead. But as he continued, the light grew brighter, edging closer. Nate's unease turned to a knot of fear when he glanced back and saw that the light wasn't a headlight at all. Instead, it appeared to be a single, flickering lantern. It glowed an unnatural shade of blue, wavering in the fog like a will-o'-the-wisp. He tightened his grip on the wheel, telling himself it was just a trick of the light. But the closer the lantern got, the more he began to feel something wrong. A prickling sensation crawled up his neck, and an icy chill filled the car. His hands trembled as he pressed the accelerator, but the light only kept pace, its glow relentless. Then, without warning, his radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, loud and grating, drowning out his thoughts. He reached over, fumbling with the dial to turn it off, but it wouldn't budge. The static grew louder, rising to a screech, before abruptly cutting out. In the silence that followed, a voice echoed through the speakers, soft and low, filled with a sorrowful tone that chilled him to the core. "Nate, you can't run." His heart pounded as he looked around, the lantern in his rearview mirror growing brighter, closer. The fog was thicker now, swirling around his car like smoke, and the temperature had dropped to a freezing cold. His breath fogged up in front of him, and the windows began to frost over, the thin layer of ice spreading as if something invisible were pressing against the glass. He didn't dare look back again. Instead, he pushed the gas pedal to the floor, his car roaring down the narrow road. But no matter how fast he drove, the lantern stayed with him, its light impossibly close, illuminating the inside of his car with that sickly blue glow. Then he saw it, a figure in the road ahead. It was standing still, right in the middle of his path, holding a lantern that matched the one in his rearview mirror. Nate's stomach dropped as he realized he couldn't avoid it. He slammed on the brakes, skidding to a halt just inches from the figure. It was a man, tall and thin, wearing an old-fashioned suit that looked damp and rotting, as if it had been pulled from the bottom of a lake. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and water dripped from his clothes onto the asphalt. He stared at Nate with hollow, sunken eyes, his face twisted into a mournful expression. Nate felt paralyzed, unable to look away as the man slowly raised his lantern, casting that unnatural blue glow over the car. He mouthed something, his lips moving silently before his voice came through the radio once more, soft and haunting. "You took the wrong road, Nate." The man stepped forward, and Nate felt the temperature drop even further. His fingers were numb, his breath shallow, his body locked in place as the figure approached. The man's empty eyes bore into his, filled with a sadness that seemed to seep into his very soul. Nate's instincts screamed at him to drive, to get away, but he was rooted to the spot. The man reached out, his hand pressing against the window, leaving a cold, wet imprint. His voice filled the car again, barely a whisper. "Come with me. It's time." With every ounce of strength, Nate tore his gaze away, slamming the car into reverse. He floored the gas, his tires screeching as he sped backward, away from the figure. But in the rearview mirror, he saw more figures, all holding lanterns, their faces pale and blank, emerging from the fog. They lined the road, one after another, forming an endless procession of silent, mournful spirits. As he turned the car around, he could feel them watching him, their empty gazes piercing through the fog. His heart raced as he drove back the way he came, the cold fading, the fog thinning with each mile. But just as he thought he was safe, a faint, static-filled whisper crackled through his radio one last time. "There's no way home, Nate. We'll see you again, soon." He never took Old Mill Road again, but every so often, on quiet nights when he was alone in his car, he would catch a glimpse of a blue light in his rearview mirror, flickering like a distant lantern, just waiting for him to come back.